Welcome back in this room for the second last part of this summit, the panel discussion on our topic, dangerous substances. And I will moderate it and present you all the people who are involved into this panel discussion and the keynote speaker, but we will start with an introduction from our Executive Director, Krista Sedlacek.
Thank you, Lothar. Welcome back after the coffee, and dear colleagues. As you are all aware, the use of chemicals in our world is growing. I mean, we had this discussion yesterday, and we will continue today. Here in EU-OSHA, we deal not only with dangerous substances in this campaign, but also we have published numerous research reports and articles on carcinogens in workplaces, for example, or on specific risks within particular sectors and occupations. But dangerous substances are not just found in workplaces. They are all around us and not just a concern for policymakers in the area of employment. We see many developments in the area of green technologies, for instance, based on chemical substances and processes. Think about the debate surrounding electric cars. These need huge batteries, and the electricity for these batteries is produced by chemical processes. Just a few months ago, the EU agreed on a circular economy action plan. This will result in an enormous increase in recycling and in the number of people working in the recycling industry. These workers will have to deal with numerous substances, be they from used electric devices like mobile phones or solar panels or a myriad of other materials. It's worth remembering that the average mobile phone contains between 40 to 50 chemical elements. Now we are all using our mobile phones here today for our work, for photos, for slideshows, among other things, and that is not dangerous, of course. But we do need to recognize that there are workers exposed to these very substances during mining, manufacturing, production, repair, and waste disposal. The European Commission has responded to many concerns raised, and especially over the past 3 years, we have seen the regulation of more and more substances and their potential damage to workers under the revision of the Carcinogens and Mutagens Directive. This initiative began under the stewardship of Commissioner Marianne Thyssen and the EU Dutch presidency, and it is very encouraging that it is continuing. And I'm delighted to see that EU Commission President-elect Ursula von der Leyen has expressed her commitment to continue this work into the next phase once she takes over in Brussels. Meanwhile, successive EU presidencies have pledged their support to the roadmap on carcinogens, also created by the presidency of the Netherlands, a very important political step. But we are not working in a vacuum. We know that well here in EU-OSHA, and we are all aware of the wider context in which we live when it comes to the world of dangerous substances. Therefore, to get a broader view of the current scientific discussion, we are going beyond the occupational health and safety perspective to also try to understand how chemical substances are used, assessed, regulated, and monitored. And for this, we benefit from the work being done by the European Chemicals Agency, the European Food Safety Agency, the European Maritime Safety Agency, the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction, and the Joint Research Center. As EU agencies, we need to work together if we want to make progress in this field. We have many challenges, risks from existing substances, risk from new substances, and also from legacy substances like asbestos or PCB in buildings. For EU agencies, collaboration, transparency, exchange, and trust are key. So this brings me to our very interesting keynote speech to have a deeper look at this broader context. I'm very happy to introduce you now Gret Schöters, who is the Vice Chair of the Scientific Committee of the European Environment Agency in Copenhagen. What lessons can we learn from the bigger picture? I'm sure Gret will provide lots of inspiration for us to think about and to stimulate debate amongst the members who will follow here. Only one last comment. Don't forget you can ask questions using the Slido, or maybe later on simply put your hands up. So Gret, the floor is yours.
So, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the agency for the invitation to talk to you here this morning. And my talk will be largely as a vice chair from the Scientific Committee of the European Environmental Agency. It will be largely based on a seminar we organized in the European Environmental Agency Scientific Committee on chemicals for a sustainable future. The European Environmental Agency, I would like to introduce it shortly. It's located in Copenhagen, and it collects information and monitoring data on the environment from Europe. It works together with 1,800 experts from more than 400 national institutions and also coming from 39 countries. The information is translated into knowledge, and this knowledge is fed into European policy. So the agency operates at the interface of science and policies. So chemicals is, of course, part of the environment and is used. And chemicals are important for Europe, as the chemical manufacturing industry is the third most important manufacturing industry in Europe. It's also expected that the volume of chemicals will further increase globally. It's expected to increase to triple again by 2050. It's also expected that the number of chemicals, the diversity of chemicals, will still increase, and there are already many different chemicals on the market. The European agency also estimated in 2016 that more than 60% of the volume of chemicals used in Europe are hazardous to health. So there is some concern, but luckily in Europe we have this very advanced, the most advanced regulation of the world on chemicals, our REACH program. And it has been recently reviewed, and the review says that it works very well. At least in 2020, all known relevant substances of very high concern will be identified along with possible measures, regulatory measures. Also, the authorization and the restriction process seems to work very well as an effective driver for substituting these substances of very high concern. But of course, there are also further challenges. For example, many of the dossiers are not fully compliant with what is requested. And also there is, which has been mentioned already before, that chemicals and goods are transported worldwide. And if they come from outside Europe, it's very difficult. They are not always compliant with EU regulations. So there are still some problems. And the citizens in Europe are concerned. The Eurobarometer has indicated that more than 65% of the people, of European citizens, are concerned about exposure to hazardous chemicals, and more than 1/4 of them is really very concerned. There are also facts and figures with respect to health information. And as such, the World Health Organization estimated that the burden of disease in relation to chemicals was in 2016 1.6 million lives. Also, the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health published a report in 2017 publication where they linked chemical exposure at the workplace to 0.8 million deaths. There is also some information that carcinogens account to more than 100,000 work-related deaths. There is further concern with respect to other chemicals such as neurotoxicants and substances with endocrine disrupting properties, and they are not included in these figures above. So there is a lot of concern. The European Agency has published 2 reports, one in 2001 and 2013, where they looked back on chemicals, on the history of chemicals, when they were used, how they were introduced, how did we learn about their effects, and how does this relate to implementation of regulation. And they looked at more than 30 different chemicals. And what was obvious is that it takes a very long time between learning something on the effects of chemicals and really implementing legislation. One of the examples is asbestos. Asbestosis was identified in around 1929, and it took a very long time before regulations were implemented. Here you see them listed. Regulations at the workplace, but also market restrictions. It took a few decades. The same holds for lead. There were already in 1925, when there were the discussions to add tetraethyl lead to petrol, there were some concerns already expressed, but nothing happened. There was more information on health effects, where seed, brain damage in children, heart disease in adults, but it took very long before real measures were taken. And for example, lead was phased out of petrol only in 1998. I do want to emphasize that over the last decade, a lot was done also at the workplaces to put up new regulation, but nevertheless, it takes a lot of time also. Another example, PCBs and mercury. The release of the industrially accidental release of mercury in the sea in Japan occurred in 1950, and only in 2017 the Minamata Convention entered into force to govern this problem. Why is this so? This also can we read in those reports on late lessons from early warnings. First of all, there is really a knowledge deficit. Some things were not expected on forehand. For example, that asbestos caused mesothelioma. It appeared only after many years. Also, some exposure routes were not known initially. For example, the mercury released into the ocean, only when it is taken up by fish and converted into methyl mercury, it turns into a poison for humans. Sometimes we have unanticipated consequences. For example, currently it has been reported that siloxanes are measured for the moment in Arctic air. Those products are used in personal care. Those chemicals are used in personal care products. So this is really unanticipated that they would arrive at these distances. And still this is ongoing. We don't know yet a lot of effects of microplastic, of special nanoforms. So we still have a large knowledge deficit. Another reason is ambiguity, so different visions. And you are perhaps well aware about discussions between toxicologists and epidemiologists regarding endocrine disruptors. And they have their own way of looking at the problem and of interpreting the data. Also, sometimes there are really vested interests, sometimes financial interests, such as from the tobacco industry, that delays some of the implementation of measurements. This ambiguity still exists. Let's think about the discussions on bisphenol A and glyphosate, where the risk assessments from different expert groups come to different conclusions. So there is the knowledge deficit, there is this difference in visions, but there is also the uncertainty which is inherent and part of this scientific research. Before going into measures, it's often a high strength of evidence is required. It's very difficult, nevertheless, to really establish scientific causality. And very often we see that a high burden of proof is needed before actions are organized. Although it was already in 1965 that Bradford Hill said that all scientific work is incomplete and it should not give us the freedom to postpone any action. So this refers to the precautionary principle. But it's difficult, and also science very often wants to dig deeper into some issues. And for example, if you look at the number of publications on heavy metals, on phthalates and on microplastics over the last 4 years, this is from a quick search in PubMed, that you see that there are still many publications on the heavy metals, but very few on the microplastics. So science in itself is also somewhat conservative. Also because, first of all, we want to be more certain, but also the laboratories, the researchers have their traditions, their lab infrastructures, and the students often try to follow their professors. So there is a lot of conservatism also in science, and there is a lot of repetition. And this really hampers also, reduces the opportunities to look, for example, at emerging risks and to do more horizon scanning. Although there is a big need for that. If we know, for example, that about only for 500 chemicals, we have good information on the hazard and exposure, but there are still many more chemicals, 70,000 chemicals has been estimated, who are very poorly documented. So we need really this research into new areas, into new dimensions, and not repeating always the same things. Another aspect is that technology and innovation go sometimes very quickly. And it's really a challenge for research and governance to keep up with it. One example is the perfluorinated compounds. They are very nice compounds because they are water repellent and dirt repellent. They are used in many applications, for example, in foam and by firefighting, by ski waxers, in workers for fluorochemical plants, but also these chemicals are present in almost everyone from the general population. It's only in 2004 that the OECD did its first survey on this type of chemicals, and they looked only at 2 chemicals from this family, PFOS and PFOA. They are rather well documented. But meanwhile, we know, for example, from the Swedish chemical agency, Chemic, that there are now more than 4,700 of similar molecules, which we don't monitor regularly. We don't know even how to measure them. So there is a big difference between the investment in new technology, new developments, and it has been calculated that only 1% of the budget of the European research programs that goes into innovation is really spent on research on potential hazards. So this is really a discrepancy. Another aspect why it takes so long and why this is a slow process is that there is an increasing awareness of the complexity of the problem. For example, we are all exposed to different chemicals at the same time, different combinations of chemicals, and researchers and risk assessors and risk managers don't really know for the moment how to deal with this in a very good way. So this is one obvious challenge. What we also learned over the last years that it's also complex with, for example, one chemical, for example, endocrine disruptors, may have different effects in different species. For example, endocrine disruptors were shown to cause teratogenic effects in alligators, immune defects in seals, reproductive effects in prey birds. So one chemical may have different effects in different species. And also another complexity is that these chemicals are present in different media, in food, in toys, for example, in indoor air, in outdoor air, soil contamination, at the workplaces. So they come from different origin, and this brings us into the difficulty that this exceeds one policy domain. So with respect to regulation, this makes it much more complex. Another example of complexity is that it's not so simple anymore that the dose makes the poison. Recent scientific information learned us that also the timing of the exposure is very important. So there is more and more evidence that exposure to chemicals at the beginning of life, during pregnancy, in the prenatal period, really changes something and may make you more vulnerable to other stressors later in life, even after decades later. And there are even suggestions that there are transgenerational effects. This comes from experimental animals, but for several of these chemicals, it has been shown that some of the effects are transferred to the next generation, and we even now have some clues on how it may work. Epigenetics, which are important for gene expression, regulating gene expression, seems to be involved. So there is a lot of concern. My last example is on the bee colonies, the declines of the bee colonies. There are different stressors which may drive this, viruses, but also the use of neonicotinoids, the fragmentation of habitats, and it's also linked to climate change. So what we see is that recently is that more and more the stressors seem to be much more interlinked, and this makes it very complex. So if we summarize it over the last decades, what did we learn? In the 70s and 80s, we focused on single chemicals and their effects. Later on, we learned that there were multiple exposures and multiple effects. So it was already harder to manage. And more recently, we know that we have to look at this problem in a more systemic, holistic perspective. So the stressors are interlinked, and it all has to do with changes at the global level in different dimensions. So, how to tackle this? It's not straightforward. It's obvious that we have to go beyond, for example, we're thinking of linear relationships between exposure and effect, go away from the purely reductionist approaches, one chemical, one effect, deterministic or probabilistic risk assessment. We have to try more to combine data from different media, for example, look across media, and also take into account and monitor that exposure may come from different exposure routes. In Europe, we are building the IPChem platform. It's the integrated platform for chemical monitoring. And it's an open platform, and the intention is that it contains already chemical monitoring data from food, also from indoor, from the environment, water, air, and soil, and also it contains a human biomonitoring module. So all the information is brought together there, and the idea is to make it as a database which is as much as possible open and accessible to users, scientists, risk assessors, risk managers, and even information for the general public. Another example is the Human Biomonitoring Program, which is a big project in Europe, which goes from 2017 to 2021. And there we try to monitor the internal exposure from European citizens all over Europe. We get urine and blood samples and try to see what is the real exposure coming from different routes in the people in Europe. Another way of looking at the issue is that we have to try to group chemicals in order to speed up the information gathering and also the legislation. Grouping might be a way also to look together at a group of compounds and to avoid that one of these chemicals of the same group is replaced by another compound which is as hazardous as the original compound. So what we have to do, we have to really look and see where are the early warning signals. We have to look for them in different media. And also we have to look at a much wider variety of chemicals than we have done before. Instead of gathering all general data, we have really to pinpoint what are the critical parameters, what are the triggers for these effects. So we have to prioritize and focus much better than we have done before. So we also have to broaden our impact assessment. We have to think on, we have to include also not only the short-term effects, but think also on the long-term effects and including in our risk assessments. We learned also that we have to include vulnerable populations. It's not sufficient to look at the 70-kilogram male representative of the population. We have to look at effects on pregnant women, on the elderly, on children. It's also, what we also learned is that it appears that the benefits and the costs of chemicals are not equally distributed in the population. So we have to take care that not the benefits go to one part of the population and the disadvantages and the harm to another part. So this has to be looked very carefully upon. Also, we have to be careful that it's not so that we make damage outside of the border or that there is damage outside of the border of Europe. We have to include this damage also in our cost calculation. So we have to internalize this in the cost calculation. It's obvious that we have to think not only in the European context, but also globally, because chemicals and goods are transported worldwide, and borders are not so strict anymore. So we have to arrange and interact globally to solve this. We are in Europe going towards a circular economy, and this also implies that chemicals will be that we have to look not only at the manufacturing of chemicals, the use of chemicals, but also at the remanufacturing and the reuse of chemicals. So we have to really go to non-toxic material cycles, looking at the life cycle of chemicals. And of course, it's obvious that we have to try to reduce and minimize the use of these hazardous chemicals as much as possible. It may be most efficient to really concentrate and focus on upfront innovation, where we try to replace the hazardous and persistent chemicals as much as we can with safe and circular chemicals in the design phase of the chemicals. There should be also some financial mechanisms which would support this. And for example, there is maybe not enough rewarding of these innovations of safe chemicals in relation, for example, to short-term profits. So more funding of better funding of alternatives and other financial structures may help to really stimulate innovation towards the design of these safe and more circular chemicals. How to achieve this? We also may need another governing structure. And we hear a lot these days about co-creation of knowledge. And I would like to point you to how we try to work in the Human Biomonitoring Program, where we have this close collaboration between the scientific community and also policy makers, both at EU level and at national level. So we work together with a EU policy board, where the different agencies and DGs are, which dealing with chemicals are represented, and there is a good interaction. For example, for prioritizing what we should do in this research project, which chemicals to focus on, which regulatory demands are there on the table. So we want to target much more what will be taken up, what can be taken up by policies. This also has the advantage that the knowledge base is much broader because we involve all these different perspectives in priority setting, in interpretation of results. It also has the advantage that the differences between different legislations are discussed, and we are aiming towards a much more harmonized approach across policy domains. It's not important only to work together, scientists and policymakers, but also to involve at a very early stage other stakeholders, for example, from the industry, but also the general public. It's important to be really transparent and to really deal the information. This is important to build trust and also to make risk management measures much better acceptable. We need the public, we need more awareness, we need the workers to be more aware. And we have the possibility now these days to use the social media to interlink databases to make the information much more available for stakeholders and also for the public. I think we really need to use this opportunity which exists today. So, to conclude, I would like to show to you or to point to you that already in 2002, the EU agreed to achieve by 2020, so next year, that chemicals are used and produced in ways that lead to the minimization of significant adverse effects on human health and the environment. I think we have made a lot of progress, but we are definitely not yet there. And it's also good to know and to hear that the new elect president, Ursula von der Leyen, has put forward that she has promised Europe a new Green Deal, including the ambition to move towards a zero pollution level. So there is quite a challenge before us, and it's very nice to hear that Europe is prepared to lead this and to take this up further. By this, I would like to thank you, but I would also like to take the opportunity here to point to you that the European Environment Agency will come up very soon on December 4 with a new report on the state of the environment. So they have collected the information over the last 5 years. They have interpreted it and they want to give a strong statement, make a strong statement and give timely information to policymakers at the European level, but also at the national level on the state of the environment. So please keep an eye on it and I hope you will enjoy it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. Oh, that's dangerous. Good. Thank you. Yeah, before I open the panel for a reaction on this keynote speak or a statement on their view on this matter, I have one question and one remark. My question is, last time I was here in this room discussing dangerous substances was 2003. I know for sure that Elke was also there, but was anybody else here 2003? Yes, some people were, yeah, okay. So that's 16 years ago, okay. And, okay, my second remark is simply when Elke Schneider and me discussed a little bit the strategy, where's the focus of this campaign that we finish with this summit, then we thought hierarchy of measures, the first element of this hierarchy, first priority is elimination and substitution. And unfortunately, that is what Christa said, or not unfortunately, that means we have to deal with chemicals and not only with the later part, with personal protective, with technical measures, with organizational measures. And there we need to go this harder way, to identify the hazards, to make proposals for less hazardous chemicals, to collaborate with all the others, we will hear that, with all the others that are dealing with these issues, because we cannot expect that someone who produces a safety data sheet says at the end, and by the way, you can substitute my product with 10 others that are less hazardous. So in this way of communication is somehow that is might not work this way. Okay, I will present now to you the panel, and then we start with their statements. So first is Zinta Podniece from DG Employment, so our mother, we sometimes say, our mother, Directorate General. Huh? Father? No, mother. No? Sister, no. Okay. Here on this side, Tim Ballmer, Chairman of the Risk Assessment Committee of the European Chemicals Agency, I think for 8 years now. Oh, so he has heard a lot about the chemical assessment in this time. Then we have Martin Wieske, a lot of functions in Europe and in Germany from the non-ferrous metal industry in Germany, but also representing the European Association on that, and member of the working group chemicals of the advisory committee, and perhaps also known to many of you, Tony Moussou from the European Trade Union Institute, and very well known in this area of discussions in chemicals. So we have, I estimated, between 125 years of experience as some collected. So we should come to some good solutions and arguments. So I start with Zinta. Oh, Zinta, you start, please.
Thank you, Lothar. And I must say that the keynote speech was very impressive and covered broader aspects of chemicals. And for example, when you said that chemicals should be safe and circular by design, I couldn't agree more, because what is happening in the broader perspective, it's also having impact and affecting safety of workers in the workplace. But in my feedback, I would like to reflect not only what was said in the keynote speech, but also what was said during the summit in both days, in the workshops and also this morning. I understand that you want to know, Lothar, what lessons we have learned and what would be what we could bring forward for the future.
Yeah.
And this is very good and very timely question, because as probably most of participants are aware, we have been very active in this area during the last years. It was mentioned already before that we have amended EU legislation, Carcinogens and Mutagens Directive. We have adopted 3 amendments which address 26 very important carcinogenic and mutagenic substance. But it was less mentioned that we also have been working for Chemical Agents Directive. Under this directive, we adopted 2 lists of indicative occupational exposure limit values, 4th and 5th list, which together address 41 substances by setting new limit values or updating the existing limit values. And all these actions, I must say, not only will bring important change on the grounds in the workplace, but it was also a very good learning process, very good and very intense learning process for all actors involved, and in particular for us, for the Commission services, but also for scientific experts, and also for our tripartite working party on chemical members. Well, some of these lessons which we learned during this process have brought already good results, but of course there is still a lot of room for further improvements. And I just would like to mention a few examples. Cooperation between the services working on OSH chemicals legislation and REACH have been improved significantly lately to make sure that actions under both sets of legislation are complementary and they would provide synergies. Provision of the scientific advice underpinning EU-OSHA legislation in this area has been streamlined, and working party chemicals members who are sitting on both sides of me also now are looking back what has been done during the last years, what lessons can be learned and what could be done better in the future to make sure that the process is more effective, smoother and faster. Also, we identified knowledge and information gaps in the process. For example, now European agency is working on the preparation of the guide on biomonitoring. During this process, we also learned that legislation is very important. Certainly, nobody can say that legislation is not important, but legislation alone is not enough. It has to be properly enforced and implemented. It was also concluded by the results of the comprehensive ex-post evaluation of EU-OSHA legislation that implementation is still a major challenge, in particular for micro and small enterprises. Well, when we speak about implementation and enforcement, here we have to remember that not only those chemicals, not only those dangerous substances for which there are limit values set at EU level, not only those must be controlled. Each and every dangerous substance must be controlled at the workplace. We have framework directive which put these obligations. We have chemical agents directive and we have carcinogens and mutagens directive. And requirements of these directives apply to all dangerous substances. And when we speak about implementation and enforcement, then number of our stakeholders, partners, for example, Senior Labor Inspector Committee, social partners and others, they can play a key role in this process. Just mentioned one example. For example, SLIC, Senior Labor Inspector Committee, they organized a thematic day on carcinogens. And when we started preparatory work for that, actually the questions were very basic. For example, where do we look for carcinogens? In which sectors, in which works, in which occupations, in which companies? And when we find them, what do we do with them? So this was very good thematic day where to share information and discuss these types of issues. They also provide guides for labor inspectors, and yesterday in the workshop was presented one of these guides on welding fumes. And there I could also mention the example of social partner initiative in preparation for the new legislation when the conference on wood dust was organized to look at what are challenges, what are possibilities, and to share good practice examples how to be ready for the preparation of this legislation. Well, when we speak about future, I think we have to learn from the lessons that we have experienced, and we have to continue working because it's a journey. It's a journey, chemicals are still there, workers are still there, and they have to be protected. But in doing that, we have to work at all levels, at EU, national, regional, company level, and we have to work all together to contribute from each other's sides as much as we can and as much is in our hands. That would be shortly my feedback.
Yeah. Okay, a first reaction. I think we immediately continue. Tim, with
okay.
you.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me clearly. I'd like to thank Greet for a really stimulating presentation. And I have to say I agree with almost everything she said. Not quite, but almost everything. I'd like to make 3 points. Some of them are more general to do with ECHA, and the last 2 are directly related to issues here. It's often said that there are 100,000 chemicals or thereabouts in trade internationally. I've never discovered where that figure actually comes from. What I do know is that since last year, we have 22,650 chemicals registered at ECHA, above a volume of 1 ton. So for the first time, we know where those chemicals are manufactured, by whom, and in which countries. We also know what the tonnages produced are. So I think we're in a situation where we can map Europe as to where chemicals are manufactured, and we have a much clearer idea of how they're used. There was a critical note in Greet's presentation about what's in those dossiers, and it should be absolutely clear under the REACH regulation that those dossiers contain adequate safety information. Our original goal as ECHA was to do compliance checks on 5% of those dossiers. The Commission has requested us to increase that by 4 times to 20%, and that by 2027, so within the next 8 years. So by so doing, we will have covered 30% of the substances that are registered, and that should include all of the hazardous ones. So I hope that can be seen as progress coming. To do this, the agency is being reorganized starting on the 1st of January this year. My second point is about grouping of chemicals, which was also raised in the keynote. I'll take one example. That was the perfluorinated substances, which are used in as waterproofing agents. We first banned PFOS, one of the main groups, in 2010, and it later went on to the Stockholm Convention annexes. But it took till 2015-16 to tackle the next one, which was PFOA, and that will enter into force as a restriction next year only. In the meantime, my committee, RAC, has been looking at the longer chain versions and more recently the shorter chain versions. Clearly, this is a long and painstaking pathway. So our response to this is to, as part of our reorganization, to look much more at how we group substances and how we can deal with them more quickly in the future. And the perfluorinated substances are one of the top of that list to deal with. My final point is more related to worker protection and about the awareness and provision of information, particularly the information contained in those chemical safety dossiers at ECHA. Within each dossier, there should be a chemical safety report. And this is a review of the whole safety of a given substance. It should also contain exposure scenarios as to how the substance is used. Manufacturers add these exposure scenarios to safety data sheets, which then go down the supply chain to downstream users. At that point, we are aware that we have a communication issue in that the exposure scenario is a fairly complex document, and it's extremely difficult for smaller companies to interpret these documents into good workplace practices. So we will be looking at ways of transferring and translating the information in those upstream dossiers into something much more like workplace instructions, and working with all of the stakeholders to try and achieve that and encourage it. We feel that downstream users' understanding of the chemical safety information is critical for workplace safety. One of the examples of how we might collectively achieve this is to encourage companies who have assessment capacity and can assess the risks and the hazard to help those that do not, i.e. small and medium-sized enterprise further down the supply chains. And that will be a program which will be developed over the coming years. My final point is a news item. Sorry for this. We are currently discussing in RAC a restriction on intentionally introduced microplastics under the REACH regulation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Very precise, very clear. Let's continue with the Non-Ferrous Metal Association. Martin, please.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning. I think what I would like to mention is a couple of things, and it's not only from the Non-Ferrous Metals Association perspective, although a couple of metals were mentioned. I think that we are sitting here during yesterday and today's speeches and lessons to learn what we can achieve, what is the status with the different aspects, and how we come forward with a good risk assessment. I found it inspiring what we heard today also from Great, but on the other hand, sounds to me a bit like really a big wish list, a wish list of very complex aspects. And I think it's right. We are in a situation where we know a lot about chemicals. I think that during the past years, information is no longer really the problem. The problem is how to deal with that information, how to transduce that information to the ones who are dealing with that chemicals, and then how to ensure a safe use. And that is a bit of conflict, I think, that we really have to bridge the big amount of information we have with the sound risk assessment, which is then transduced in a simple language, usable, and really giving advice to the people dealing day by day with those things. And there is really something where we should focus on. I fully agree with Greg that we should focus on the critical parameters, because what affects people most is the most critical parameter. If we have others, and I think that is what is done at ECHR always, is to elucidate what is the critical parameter to derive, for example, a classification, and what we do at OSH level to derive an occupational exposure limit. So it's always the most sensitive and the critical endpoint, as we call it. And of course, there are other aspects which raise awareness and which are to be taken into account. But that brings me to the point that we always have these kind of risk perception, and it was also mentioned today, these kind of citizen view. I think that's right, that we are all consumers and we are all puzzled by information coming to us, and where we don't know, is that something where we get into a risky situation? Is there a hazard where we have an exposure to be taken into account? And that is what I think we as professionals on that area have to communicate. And that is really a kind of risk education. The world is so complex, and all these aspects of chemicals are so complex, and it's getting more and more complex. And the more we know, the more questions we have. But we have to do the art of condensing it to simple messages, to what measure to take first in order to be safe. And I think that is something where we suffer a bit also on a lack of capacities. I think that is what we learned from our companies, at least in Germany, but I think the same situation is in other countries, that we do not have so much expert always available to do this task. To set up complicated legislation is one thing. We need expert on that, but we need to transduce that into simple language and guidances, for example, at workplaces. So, and it's not that easy. And to be honest, if you are an expert, and we sometimes are working as experts and try to figure in all these expert knowledge into legislation, into guidances, and when I read that a couple of weeks later, I'm sometimes a bit astonished about what we are putting onto paper there. So, that is something I think what we should take into account for the future, and that is about communication. And that is my final, I think, main aspects. The communication between the different worlds was already addressed. So we today heard about environmental aspects. At the OSH level, of course, we always discuss the information which is coming from the REACH area. And I can tell you that I was in a workshop last week, which was called REACH versus OSH legislation, what we can do with that situation. And I think we have to overcome that situation. We have to go into a situation where we say REACH and OSH. And of course, they are coming from different angles. And my perception is, and I'm happy that Tim mentioned that, for example, the exposure scenarios, my feeling is that it comes a bit from the top. So to have a broad picture where we are and what we should do in general. But when it comes to the really individual situation at the workplaces, at the company level, at the shops, I think then we all agree that from the OSHA perspective, we need a risk assessment. And that risk assessment is more an individual one. So it comes more from the bottom. So we have to bridge really the aspects where we have these bottom information, very in-depth knowledge of what to do at the floor, and the information coming from above, which is a more general level and is sometimes also a bit difficult to understand. And you know, a safety data sheet is a nice thing, but it comes to you in the form of an extended safety data sheet with hundreds of pages, and you have to dig out the information which is important for you as an occupational expert. It's difficult to digest that. So, and that is something I think as a learning lesson that we put that together. I think it is a challenge. I think we are sitting here in a kind of combination to show you that we are engaging in that. And I can promise you that at the Working Party Chemicals level, we are dealing always with these aspects, and we try to convince each other sometimes, and also the guests from the REACH departments, that we should find solutions which are best suited to tackle the risk, to tackle the problems which we identified. So, and we should not go forward to say this is ours and we will tackle the problem, but to discuss which is the best way to arrange a safe situation for a given problem. So, and I think that means it goes beyond OSH. That also means for you that you have to be open to listen to people beyond OSH. But on the other hand, I think, and that is the last plea for the DG Employment also, to say, okay, we are the OSH people and we know quite well how to deal with some aspects, and let's inform the others. So that it becomes not a one-way discussion, but a really open dialogue. And that is my plea and my hope for the future. Thank you.
Okay, because we have one final panelist, Tony Moussou from ETUI. I forgot to mention that you are also a member of the advisory, of the Working Party Chemicals, of the advisory committee. So, please, Tony. Yeah.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me in the panel. So the keynote speech has shown that in many cases we knew, but we didn't act, or we acted too late. And of course, We heard a lot of examples: tobacco smoke, asbestos, but I can add vinyl chloride or endocrine disruptors, glyphosate, all those cases where we have collected information about the hazardous properties and action is lacking. And I can only recommend you to read a book written by David Michaels. David Michaels is the former head of US OSHA under Obama. And he wrote a book called Doubt is Their Product. So these are the strategies used by some people in industry to delay action. So the idea is to add studies and studies to add doubts and delay action. And it works very well. And that's maybe the explanation why it took so long in some cases to act. That's what we can call paralysis by analysis. And of course, we know how it works, and now we need to act. Well, one example is, for example, also the bisphenol A. You know that bisphenol A is a reprotox, but it's also an endocrine disruptor. It's now regulated at EU level, but the industry has the little brother, which is called BPS. Same family, same properties, but not enough studies to take maybe action. And so that's why I agree with Tim that the future is to work by grouping substances. That's important that we act and we regulate substances which have similar properties. The consequences of acting too late or delaying action is, of course, there's a price to pay for that. And we know that for carcinogens, we have many occupational cancers that can be, that are the consequences and that could be avoided. We did in our research institute a study on the costs of occupational cancers. And of course, they are huge. Almost 4% of the EU GDP each year. So that's hundreds of billions of euros. And of course, those costs are not only on companies, because when you have workers on sick leaves, you have production losses. Those costs are not only on social security, because you need to treat those diseases, but the costs are also on workers and their families. And that's most of the time a drama for those people and their families. Well, so what we need is, of course, a better use of the precautionary principle. So it means that we have to take action and not to delay action when we have uncertainties, but we still have enough knowledge to act. And that we don't do very well in the EU. And for that, of course, we need political will. And most of the time, that's lacking, and we can only recognize this lack of political will. So we need to use the existing knowledge to improve the existing legislation, and I'll give you some examples. So, of course, we recognize that we made good progress in the past years with the Carcinogens and Mutagens Directive, with the adoption of limit values for 25 carcinogens. But I think that we need to continue those efforts, and we know that we still have many other carcinogens that are used at work, and we need to, of course, go further And according to our study, we would need another 25 limit values to cover, I would say, 80%, 90% of the exposure at the workplace. So we are halfway, and we need to go further and adopt limit values for another 25 carcinogens. But I know that work is in progress, and together with Martin in the Working Party on Chemicals, we're working on that. Another field of the Carcinogens and Mutagens Directive that might be improved is the scope. We heard yesterday that we have reprotox chemicals in different processes at work, and that workers are exposed. And workers are not enough protected against those risks. And one way of improving the protection of workers from the risks of reprotox substances, that just to extend the scope of the CMD to the reprotox. So as you know, the CMD only covers carcinogens and mutagens, but not the reprotox that are covered under the Chemical Agents Directive. Whereas if you look at all other EU legislations, be it REACH or the biocides or pesticides regulation, carcinogens, mutagens, and reprotox are always on the same basket. So it means that, well, we need maybe to align the workers' protection legislation on the other EU chemical legislation and make it more coherent. That's what I called better regulation. Maybe what we need also in the future is to use less hazardous chemicals. And that I agree with the keynote speaker that that's certainly one way that we need to explore. And finally, I would say that we all have a role to play because we are all consumers. And the choices that we make in buying items can have a big influence on the way these items are produced. So we have, for example, NGOs that have developed an app that you can use on your mobile phone. You can scan the code bar and check whether or not the item that you want to buy contains hazardous or very hazardous chemicals, and then you decide to buy them or not. That's a very powerful tool. So that's these kind of things that maybe might change the way we use hazardous chemicals. So to conclude, I would say that, of course, we need a good balance between the benefits of chemicals and let's be frank, chemicals, they of course are giving jobs to many people, and we cannot imagine a world without chemicals, pharmaceuticals, the clothes that we wear, and so on. But on the other side, we know, and it has been shown in the keynote speech, that we also have adverse effects, and of course we need to strike the right balance. The right balance, but of course, as a word of conclusion, I think that it's important to say that profits for companies and competitiveness should not take precedence over the life of people. And with that reflection, I will stop my intervention. Thank you.
Yeah. I can imagine that there's an urgent need to respond between the panelists, but we promised discussion, invitation of the public, the audience, and I'm sure there are some questions already. Can I do something to show them here, or are you doing that? Okay. Oh, can you see them here? Good. Oh, can anybody of you answer to this first question? Christa, you, yeah.
At least read EU-OSHA. I think what we are doing, I mean, in EU-OSHA, we are working together with all experts in the field, of course, and we also try to improve the communication via these experts. But I wouldn't be able to say what we can do to get more occupational hygienists in Europe. You know, occupational hygienists do not exist in all member states. There are other expressions or other occupations linked to this general occupational hygienist term. So what I can say is only to improve the communication between the practitioners and the experts in the field, but that's it.
Yeah. Okay, occupational hygienist is sure one tool to implement more. So we have another question. Who is controlling the quality of the data in those databases? You mean probably the ECHA databases? Or can somebody say something? Which databases? Otherwise, we are probably. Let's guess.
I'll assume it's the ECHA databases and try and give you an answer. As I said, the original plan was to do a quality check on 5% of the registrations, and that will be increased to 20%, covering about 30% of the substances. And within that, largely the hazardous substances. Not everything registered is hazardous. So that will be done by ECHA in the coming years. Thank you.
More? Sorry. Oh. So.
Yeah.
Oh, it's back again. Oh, that's a difficult. Does anybody want to say? Yeah, Martin?
I can eventually say something because it's an aspect which is regarding implementation potentially such kind of issues at company levels. So I think all the companies are taking these discussions on climate change quite seriously, and they tackle it. But honestly, OSH and CO2 is a completely different world. And I think we have our limit values for that, and we take that, of course, pretty seriously. But it's something different if it comes to, let's say, CO2 fingerprint or something like that. That is really a sustainability aspect, which is taking a lot of efforts at the moment in the companies, I'm pretty sure. And if you do as an OSH expert your part and engage on that, everybody would be happy. But on the other hand, I think this is very often in other hands, honestly.
You have a tip?
Yeah, a slightly different angle maybe. I think we need to look at chemicals in a much more end-to-end way. An example raised by Greet was about lead, and lead has been used as a stabilizer in PVC. Think of things like windows and doors. So in buildings for many years, it's been banned, but the legacy of lead in PVC is still there. So the question is, what do you do with it when it gets to end of life? And you have two choices. Either you recycle it back into PVC products, in which case you recycle the lead as well. With new PVC and lead PVC, you dilute it, but you don't get rid of the problem. Or you identify it, it's relatively easy to identify, and you incinerate it, and you produce CO2. You also produce lead in the ash from the incinerator, which probably can't be used for streets and paving like most ash is. So you have a double problem. And I think we need to consider these types of problems. This one is not specifically about a workplace issue, but they do arise in recovering materials and what we do with them. And CO2 is an intrinsic part of that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question. Anonymous. How to improve knowledge on the hierarchy of control measures across policy areas and in safety data sheets, for example. I think perhaps my comment that you don't have substitution information in most safety data sheets because you cannot cannibalize your own product by saying others are less dangerous. Yeah, please, Tony.
Yeah, we don't have information on safety data sheets on substitutes or possible alternatives, but we have on the internet databases on a good example of substitution, and I can mention maybe the Subsport portal, which is a very good one, collecting examples of successful substitution that can help and inspire other companies. So that's things that we maybe should work on and make sure that these databases are updated and that they continue to expand.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because I was certain years responsible for that. Okay, Tim, you?
Okay, there's a new question now. I was going to answer the previous one, but just very briefly, on the hierarchy of control, under REACH, when we're authorizing dangerous chemicals for continued use in workplaces, one of the first things we look at is the hierarchy of control. So it applies equally under REACH as it does under OSHA, and I think that the perception is that this is one of the most critical aspects of controlling exposure in workplaces.
Yeah, that's a new question. You can read that. How many requests for OL setting are expected from DG Empl to RAC? Can that be answered?
Actually, I wanted to add something to the previous question about
sorry.
Hierarchy of control and how to work together with other policy areas, because you know, for the Commission service, we have usually inter-service consultations where we speak together with all the relevant other DGs. And when it goes for chemicals, obviously, we have very close collaboration with REACH DGs, with DG Grow, Environment and Santé. And here we make sure that OSH legislation is part of the process. And usually it says without prejudice to EU-OSHA legislation, because that's the legislation which applies for workers' protection. And hierarchy of control, of course, it's part of our OSHA legislation. Even if there are complementary legislative parts under REACH or for example, biocides, OSHA legislation applies, so which means hierarchy of control applies, and it's incorporated in other pieces of legislation. And then for how many requests for OEL settings are expected in 2020 from DG Empl to RAC? Well, we are now in the planning stage, and for the moment we have thought about two substances, but it's not only OELs. What we are asking RAC to do, for example, during these 3 amendments of CMD, there are some legally binding requirements for the Commission to do some assessments, and we will ask also part of these assessments that RAC would carry out.
Before we come perhaps to the next question, Gret, you didn't have the chance to react on the reactions. But I thought you have written a lot. Perhaps you want to say something.
No, I was thinking that what comes out is that it's really very important to share information. That's what I hear a lot. And I also was pleasantly informed about this database on substitutions, which can be used by different users. So I think it's important to share information, and I know that I'm working in the environmental health area, and I know that there's a lot of information available in companies also, and exposure of people and so, but it's still very hard to come to this information. So if this could also be opened, that would be very nice and very welcome, I think, to learn more about exposure and hazards and health. There is a lot of information with respect to workers, I think. And the other aspect, I was very pleased to hear that ECHA will invest on making the information easily available for users, which I think is a challenge, but it's really a need also, because we are living in a world that people use a lot of social media, a world of fake news, so we need some trustworthy organizations which disseminate and which so but it's not easy to disseminate this type of information. So I think we will have to be very we will have to be very creative, but I think it's really, really important that we go that way. Thank you.
Okay. Tony, yeah.
Yes, if I may comment on the limit values that are needed quite soon. You know, setting limit values at EU level, that's a quite long and complex process. But the social partners have an important role in advising the Commission on which are the priority chemicals. And so we have in the Advisory Committee on Health and Safety in Luxembourg a working group. Martin and myself, we are part of that working group. And there we discussed what are the priority chemicals. So what should be the next one on the list on the CMD. And just to mention one that we have agreed that should be a priority, that's asbestos. You know that the limit value for asbestos is quite old and it needs an update. So it's not yet in the pipeline of ECHA, but we hope that very soon it will be. Of course, ECHA has a limited capacity to provide scientific opinions on limit values and carcinogens. I think that's between 2 and 5 substances maximum per year. So you can make your own calculation and see how long it will take to have the 25 extra that we need.
So, there are more questions even. How is the carcinogen exposure survey coming along? Will it give us new knowledge? Oh, that's a question to EU-OSHA. Who wants to, who? I don't understand, sorry. Me? You? Krista?
I think I can start.
Yeah, please.
So we are in the preparation of the exposure survey. We know, you know, this is a new methodology stemming from Australia, and we are now in the preparatory phase. And the deadlines, I don't know, but as I said, in 2020 we will at least have the framework how to go on in developing further this exposure survey. I don't think that Elke is, or Marine, maybe could say some deadlines. You will get the microphone.
It's the worst place to be for getting a microphone. Okay. No.
No. No. God.
Can you? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Good morning, everyone. The planning for the worker exposure survey, the first phase will start next year with the preparatory work, the adaptation of the questionnaire to Europe. As Krista mentioned, it's an Australian survey, so we need adaptation to the European context and translation mainly. And the survey will be on the field in 2022, and before there will be a testing phase in 2021, and we will get the first findings in 2023. Is it what you wanted me to mention?
Yeah,
fine. Okay.
And I think we can say, will it give us new knowledge? Yes, because this is a unique survey we are starting, quite successful and well accepted in Australia. Of course, you can't do it, as Marine said, we have to adapt it to the EU context, but for sure it will us give new knowledge, more insight related to occupations and tasks done in companies, and I think we will get a better picture what is used and which carcinogens are used at company level.
Yeah. The special feature is perhaps that we don't ask the workers which substances they use, but we ask them what they are doing. And behind that is a kind of expert system saying, if you do this and that, then you have probably these risk factors. And because it's not of use to ask many workers whether they use a certain complex chemical or not. Okay. There's another question. I think it's the last before I give the floor again for a final word to the panel. Dockers, is this company who produces these shoes, or is this the name of someone? Yeah. Okay. Or dock workers? I don't know. So dangerous substances come from countries outside the EU through the ports. The safety control is later. It's dockers. It's dock workers. Yeah. Okay. Is later to handling by dock workers. How can we protect these workers? I have to mention that there was a little study of the EU-OSHA 2 years ago about the fumigated containers coming into Europe and how much of this fumigation chemical, which is of course by intention toxic, is still in the container, and dock workers might be exposed. So they had a collaboration with us, and so they are quite informed what is happening between the fumigation in the third world or other country and reaching European ports. So does anybody want to say something? Yeah.
Well, come to talk to me later and I will give you the name. I don't want to make publicity for an app.
You have another app.
Yeah. But come to me and
Yeah, okay. What was the name of the app? Okay, that's already.
Already responded.
Okay, so I think we can come to a final word after you heard this discussion. You see the questions. Excellent key speech. Okay. Yeah, that's for you, Gret. No, that's not a question.
No, thank you very much, because when do we have concrete guidelines? Well, I will look at my colleagues here as soon as possible, I would say, because I think we need it.
Yeah. So any final word? Perhaps we start here and then we go through, if you want to have to say something at the end of the...
Final round of comments, or what do you mean?
A final round for you. It's 12:30.
Okay.
And we need to finish.
1 minute, okay. Just one answer to these concrete questions of the dock workers. I think it's a valid question, so you need sometimes really concrete information. I advise you sometimes to look at your national regulations. I at least can say that in Germany we have a very concrete rule on that. A very concrete one where you have to follow instructions when to open specific containers, for example, if there is fumigates in and etc. Okay. So a very specific one where it is addressed in order to protect the people, because it comes from the outside of the European Union, and that makes things sometimes a bit more complicated. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And as a last word, eventually, just by this. This is the European world, and sometimes the question was also, what about the aspects coming from the outside of the European Union? So the outreach of OSH and all these aspects, I think that will be a further challenge for us. As a last word, I think we should focus sometimes on both, and that's not easy, to develop processes and ideas for the future, how to tackle very complex aspect, but don't forget, and that is really a plea, don't forget the simple answers, the simple solutions, the simple language to help people at their really day-by-day work. And that is where some of the questions also understand for. That is, I think, what we all should keep in mind when we are dealing at elaborated level, like in the workplace chemicals level. Don't forget to protect these people in their daily work. Thank you.
Great. Cinta?
From my side, I just would like to repeat that protecting workers from dangerous substance, it's really a journey, and we have to keep walking, and we have to walk together and work very closely all together. And also, after time, I think it's important to acknowledge that we have done something good, which will bring very good results to the workplace. Just say thank you to each other and appreciate what we have done together, because it also gives strength to continue our journey and to walk forward.
Okay.
And thank you all the involved people and
Tony?
partners and stakeholders.
Oh, sorry, Zinta. Yeah, Tony.
So same message as Zenta. I think that we all need to work together. That's what we try to do in the Working Party on Chemicals. And tripartite dialogue is extremely important, because whatever the solution that we implement, it has to be discussed and agreed by everyone. And we always need, of course, to strike the right balance. So dialogue is extremely important. And I hope that we will continue to work all together to improve workers' protection.
Gustav, do you want to have a final word now or final?
No, I only wanted to, because what Gret was presenting and then Martin commented it is a wish list. I think sometimes we still need a vision. And I see to see the full picture and at least know that we need to do a lot and put a lot of efforts in the future to improve the situation for all, for the environment, for workers and all the society and people affected. So let's keep it on the agenda to have a vision.
Yeah. Tim?
I think my reflection of yesterday and today is very much about communication, and it's been mentioned, I think, in most of the sessions and also this morning, about the need to get information into the right place, in the right form, so that people have the best chance of understanding it in the workplace. Thank you.
And great.
So I think I would also like to emphasize that it's very important to work together across policy domains, that things should be solved together. It's complex, but I think Europe has shown already by the REACH program that there is a way forward. And it's important to involve all stakeholders in that effort, and not at the end, not to communicate to, but also from the beginning, to make them accountable for what we are doing. Because it's not enough to point to risk, it's important that this risk is accepted and that people take care of how they should behave, so that they really change their behavior. So I think it's important to work all together from the start.
Yeah. I have no final word, only to thank you for staying here. It was an opportunity to see very experienced people from a different view, a little bit different view, a more different view, talking on the same issue. So how to make progress in this area of chemicals as such, of dangerous substances at workplaces in particular. And so I have to thank you all for this contribution, for your preparation, particularly you for your preparation, and the statements and the opinions and the discussion and the responses to the questions. And so we can close this panel discussion for today and discuss further, not in other panels and workshops. Thank you for listening and. Yeah. Okay.